Picture yourself stepping into the cool, dimly lit corridors of a medieval monastery, centuries ago. The air is thick with the scent of ancient stone, beeswax candles, and something unexpected, something rich, earthy, and deeply alluring. In the quiet of the early hours, long before the world outside has stirred, robed figures move with calm purpose around copper kettles and wooden barrels. They aren't just praying or copying manuscripts, they're crafting something extraordinary. What if I told you that some of the most revolutionary beer recipes in history weren't born in bustling commercial breweries, but within these silent, hallowed walls? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on medieval monastic brewing, a practice where devotion, science, and a little bit of divine inspiration came together in ways that would forever change the world of brewing. This isn't just a story about beer, it's a tale of human ingenuity thriving in the unlikeliest of places. Behind those heavy monastery doors, monks weren't merely seeking spiritual solace. They were pioneering groundbreaking techniques, honing recipes through trial, prayer, and an almost alchemical understanding of nature. Their work laid the foundation for brewing traditions we still cherish today. Think about it. In an age without modern thermometers, precise measurements, or even a clear understanding of yeast, these dedicated brewers achieved consistency and quality that would impress even the most skilled modern craft brewers. How did they do it? What secrets did they uncover in their pursuit of both spiritual and earthly perfection? Join me as we step back in time to explore this fascinating intersection of faith and fermentation. We'll uncover how monastic communities across Europe perfected methods like cool fermentation, barrel aging, and the use of local botanicals, creating beverages that sustain their brothers, supported their communities, and occasionally, if the stories are true, touch the divine. This journey is about more than just historic recipes. It's about the timeless human drive to create, to innovate, and to find meaning in even the most humble tasks. So settle in, and let's unravel the mysteries together, because what we're about to discover might just change the way you think about beer, history, and the quiet power of dedication. To truly understand why brewing became so deeply embedded in monastic life, we need to look beyond the beverage itself and into the very rhythm of their existence. For a medieval monk, beer was far more than a simple pleasure. It was a fundamental pillar of daily survival and spiritual practice. In an era when clean drinking water was often a luxury and sometimes a danger, the process of brewing, which involved boiling water, produced a safe, nutritious drink that could be stored for months. This wasn't just about avoiding illness. It was about ensuring the community had a reliable source of hydration that also provided essential calories and nutrients. During the strict fasting periods that dotted the liturgical calendar, when solid food was restricted for hours or even days, a hearty, grain-based beer known as liquid bread became a crucial source of sustenance, allowing the brothers to maintain their strength for prayer and manual labor without breaking their vows. This practice was deeply supported, perhaps unintentionally, by the foundational guidelines that governed their lives. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, emphasized the virtues of self-sufficiency, manual labor, and hospitality. It instructed monasteries to be entirely self-contained communities, where the brothers grew their own food, made their own goods, and provided for all their needs within the monastery walls. It also commanded them to welcome every traveler as if they were welcoming Christ himself. This created a powerful practical need for brewing. They had to produce enough not only for themselves, but also to offer refreshment and charity to the weary pilgrims and poor who arrived at their gates. A nourishing beer was a tangible act of Christian charity. Furthermore, the rule's insistence that idleness is the enemy of the soul meant that every monk was expected to be engaged in productive work. In the quiet hours between prayer services, tending the brew kettle was a perfect, contemplative task that transformed raw, earthly ingredients into something both practical and precious. The economic role of beer within and beyond the monastery walls also cannot be overstated. While monks took a vow of poverty, their monasteries needed financial resources to operate, to maintain their buildings, and to fund their charitable works. The beer they brewed became a valuable commodity. It was used as a form of payment for taxes and tithes to local lords and the church. It was traded for other goods they couldn't produce themselves. And in some cases, it was even sold commercially, with some monastic breweries, like the one at the St. Gallen Monastery in Switzerland, evolving into large-scale operations that supported the entire economic foundation of the community. This intricate relationship between devotion, daily necessity, and economics created a unique environment where the art of brewing wasn't just permitted. It was actively encouraged and meticulously perfected over centuries, blending spiritual duty with earthly craftsmanship in a way that was truly unique to the monastic world. While the image of a robed monk tending a brew kettle feels universal, the reality is that this sacred craft was championed by specific religious orders, each with their own unique traditions and contributions. The most famous association today is with the Trappists, a reformed branch of the Cistercian order known for their strict silence and world-renowned beers. However, it's crucial to understand that the Trappists, as we know them, are a much later development, emerging from reforms in the 17th century. The true medieval pioneers of monastic brewing were their spiritual ancestors and other established orders. Foremost among these were the Benedictines, whose very rule, as we discussed, provided the foundational justification and necessity for the practice. Monasteries following the rule of Saint Benedict, which spread across Europe from the 6th century onward, became the bedrock of brewing knowledge. Their large, self-sufficient communities required vast quantities of beer, leading to a scale of production that demanded innovation and skill. Another significant group was the Cistercians themselves, who broke from the Benedictines in the 11th century, seeking a stricter, more austere interpretation of the rule. They established their abbeys in remote valleys, far from the distractions of towns, and their emphasis on hard manual labor and self-sufficiency made brewing a natural and vital pursuit. Their isolation often meant they had to be even more resourceful, relying on local water sources, grains, and whatever botanicals they could forage to create their unique brews. Other orders, like the Augustinian canons, also engaged deeply in brewing, often running hospitals and hospices where beer was considered a form of medicine for both patients and pilgrims. Within the hierarchical structure of a monastery, the responsibility for this crucial task did not fall to just any brother. It was entrusted to one of the most important officials in the entire community, the cellarer. This was not a simple job. It was a position of immense responsibility and trust. The cellarer was essentially the monastery's chief provisioner, its head of storage, and its quartermaster all rolled into one. He was responsible for managing all the food and drink stocks, ensuring there was enough to feed the entire monastic family and all their guests throughout the year, through plentiful harvests and lean winters. His domain was the cellarium, the storage cellar, from which his title was derived. The rule of Saint Benedict provides specific instructions for the type of man who should hold this office, describing him as someone wise, of mature character, sober, not a great eater, not proud, not excitable, not offensive, not slow, not wasteful, but a God-fearing man who may be like a father to the whole community. He had to be meticulously organized, possess a deep understanding of agriculture and preservation, and have the business acumen to trade surplus goods. When it came to brewing, his duties were comprehensive. He oversaw the sourcing of the finest barley and hops, managed the complex brewing schedule around the liturgical calendar, and ensured the consistent quality of every batch. He was both a master craftsman and a logistical genius, balancing spiritual duty with earthly practicality. The beer he produced was a direct reflection of his care and skill, a liquid embodiment of the monastery's values of quality, charity, and devotion to duty. Walking into the monastery brewery, you'd first notice its strategic placement within the larger community, a careful decision that speaks to the monks' brilliant understanding of practicality and resource management. These breweries were almost always situated near two critical features: a reliable, clean water source and the monastery kitchens. A flowing stream or a dedicated well was the literal lifeblood of the operation, providing not only the main ingredient, but also the power for grinding grain and the means for cleaning the heavy equipment. Proximity to the kitchens was equally vital. The brewing process required immense heat, and rather than building a separate, costly fire, the monks would often use the same hearth that cooked their daily meals, efficiently sharing warmth and labor. This setup created a hub of self-sufficiency, where waste from baking bread could find new purpose in the mash tun, and steam from the brew kettle would mingle with the scent of baking oats and simmering stews. At the heart of this operation stood the tools of the trade, each one a testament to functional local craftsmanship. The most prominent fixture was the mash tun or kettle, a massive cauldron hammered from thick copper or sometimes iron. This is where the magic began, where milled grain met hot water in a process called mashing, transforming starches into fermentable sugars. These kettles were enormous, capable of holding hundreds of liters, and were suspended over an open fire that required constant, careful attention to maintain just the right temperature. Next to it, you'd find large wooden vessels, often carved from a single great oak or held together with sturdy iron bands. These were the fermenters. Unlike our modern sterile steel tanks, these wooden tuns were living ecosystems. The porous oak harbored wild yeasts and bacteria from previous batches, each monastery's unique microflora imparting a distinct house character to every brew, a true taste of place long before the concept of terroir was applied to beer. For moving and aerating the hot wort, the monks used long-handled paddles made of hardwoods like beech or ash. Shaped by hand and worn smooth with years of use, these were essential for stirring the mash to prevent scorching and for encouraging oxygenation as the liquid cooled, a vital step for the health of the yeast to come. Perhaps the most fascinating piece of equipment, and one that highlights their clever use of natural principles, was the coolship. This was a wide, shallow pan, typically made of copper or wood, that looked like a large baking sheet. After boiling, the hot wort was transferred into this vessel and left exposed to the cool night air, often in a dedicated attic or chamber with louvered windows. This wasn't just for cooling, it was the primary method of inoculation. As the wort sat, wild yeasts present in the air carried on the breeze from the orchard, the farm, or the grain store would settle into the liquid, beginning the spontaneous fermentation that would create their distinctive ale. There were no thermometers or hydrometers. The monks relied on experience passed down through generations, judging temperatures by hand and progress by the look, smell, and taste of their brew. This entire setup, from the placement by the water to the handmade tools, was a masterpiece of pre-industrial engineering, perfectly designed to work in harmony with the natural world and the rhythm of monastic life. And at the very heart of every one of these meticulously crafted batches was an ingredient so fundamental it was often taken for granted. Yet the monks understood its divine significance better than anyone: water. For a medieval monastery, securing a pure, abundant water supply wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was a sacred duty, and their approach to it blended faith with a form of early hydraulic engineering. Many monastic communities were founded near a natural spring, a site often chosen for its symbolic purity as much as its practical utility. These springs weren't merely water sources, they were considered gifts from God, and the monks went to extraordinary lengths to protect and channel this liquid life. They constructed sophisticated systems of lead or hollowed-out wooden pipes, building aqueducts and conduits that would carry the water directly into the brewery, the kitchen, and the infirmary, ensuring its cleanliness was preserved from source to vessel. This reverence for water was deeply practical, as its quality directly dictated the character of the beer. The monks, through patient observation over generations, became unwitting masters of hydrochemistry. They learned that water drawn from a limestone aquifer would be rich in minerals like calcium and carbonate, creating a harder water that was perfect for brewing richer, darker ales, as it helped extract color and flavor from the roasted grains. Conversely, water from a soft, rain-fed spring, low in minerals, would produce a cleaner, crisper beer, allowing the subtle notes of the herbs and grains to shine through. They may not have understood the precise science of ion exchange or pH levels, but they possessed an empirical, hands-on knowledge of how their local water behaved in the mash tun. A batch that failed, that turned sour or cloudy, could often be traced back to a change in the water source, perhaps a spring corrupted by runoff after a heavy rain. This direct link between nature's provision and the quality of their work meant protecting the water source was synonymous with protecting their livelihood and their act of worship. This connection between the practical and the spiritual often blurred into the realm of legend. There are countless stories, passed down through the centuries, of abbey springs and wells that were believed to be blessed, their waters possessing healing properties. While a modern mind might attribute any medicinal benefits to the simple fact that the boiled, fermented beer was safer to drink than contaminated village water, for the medieval world, the distinction was meaningless. The entire process, from the moment the water emerged from the sacred ground to when it was transformed into nourishing beer, was seen as a continuous act of divine grace. The water was a blessing, and so too was the beverage it became. This profound respect for their primary ingredient meant that every step of the brewing process began with an acknowledgement of this gift, a silent prayer of thanks for the clear, cold water that made their contemplative work and their very survival possible. After securing their sacred water source, the monks turned their attention to the very soul of their beer, the grain. This was far more than a simple ingredient. It was the backbone of the brew, the source of its color, its body, and its essential fermentable sugars. While barley reigned supreme for its ideal enzyme content and husk structure, monastic brewing was never about rigid dogma, but about resourceful adaptation. The specific grains that filled a monastery's storage barns were a direct reflection of its local landscape and agricultural reality. In regions where barley flourished, it formed the undisputed foundation of the brew. Yet in times of poor harvest or in areas where other grains were more plentiful, monks expertly blended wheat for a softer, cloudier head and a bready character, oats for a silky, smooth fullness, and rye for a distinctive, spicy complexity that could cut through the richness of a hearty ale. This pragmatic approach ensured that the community was never without its vital beverage, even when the preferred grain was scarce. The transformation of these raw grains into brewing-ready malt was a meticulous, multi-day ritual performed entirely within the monastery grounds, often in a dedicated malt house. It began with steeping, where the harvested grain was submerged in large wooden vats of clean water for a day or two, allowing it to absorb moisture and awaken from its dormant state. The water was then drained away, and the damp grain was spread thickly across the malting floor, a spacious, often stone-lined room where the critical process of germination could begin. Here, monks would tirelessly turn the grain with large wooden rakes, hour after hour, to prevent the rootlets from matting together and to control the temperature generated by this new, sprouting life. This was a race against time. They needed to allow just enough growth for the starches inside the kernel to begin breaking down into simpler sugars, but not so much that the precious seed consumed those very sugars to fuel its own growth. Once the maltster judged the germination to be perfect, a skill learned through touch, taste, and smell, this growth had to be violently halted to preserve the sugars. This was achieved through kilning, where the green malt was transferred to a kiln, a dedicated oven often heated by a gentle wood fire burning on a hearth below. The type of wood and the intensity of the heat applied here were among the monk brewers' most powerful tools for crafting flavor. A low, smoldering fire of fruitwood or oak would produce a pale, base malt, perfect for lighter table beers. A hotter fire would caramelize the sugars, creating richer, sweeter caramel malts. And if the grain was exposed to direct smoke and high heat, it resulted in deeply roasted, dark malts that imparted the characteristic coffee and chocolate notes we associate with the strongest monastic ales and porters. This entire malting process, from soaking to kilning, was a profound act of collaboration with nature. The monks weren't just using an ingredient, they were guiding it through a fundamental transformation, unlocking its hidden potential through patience, observation, and a deep respect for the natural forces at their command. Once the malt was perfectly kilned and cooled, the next step was to transform these whole, toasted grains into a form that could release their precious sugars. This was the job of the mill, a piece of technology that was as vital to the monastery's economy as it was to its brewery. While smaller communities might use a simple hand quern, larger, wealthier monasteries often boasted an impressive water-powered mill, a marvel of medieval engineering situated on a stream flowing through their land. The rhythmic, grinding rumble of the heavy millstones became a familiar sound, a backdrop to daily life that signaled the ongoing work of sustenance. For communities without a reliable water source, animal power, a patient ox or donkey walking in an endless circle, would turn the stones instead. The goal of milling wasn't to pulverize the grain into a fine powder, but to carefully crack open each husk and break the starchy interior into coarse particles. This mixture of husks and grain fragments was known as grist. The monk operating the mill had to possess a keen eye and a sensitive touch. If the stones were set too close together, they would produce a flour-like dust that would, during mashing, become an impenetrable, gluey mass that no amount of water could penetrate, trapping all the valuable sugars inside. If the stones were too far apart, the grains would remain largely whole, offering too little surface area for the hot water to work its magic. The perfect grind was a consistent, coarse meal where every kernel was broken apart, but the husk remained largely intact. These husks would later act as a natural filter bed in the mash tun, allowing the sweet liquid wort to drain clear while holding back the spent grain. After milling, the fresh grist was carefully collected in sacks or barrels. Before it even reached the brew kettle, it was often evaluated by the cellarer or the brewer himself. He would run the grist through his fingers, feeling for the right texture, and might even taste a pinch, assessing the quality of the crush and the toasted flavor of the malt. This tactile, intimate knowledge of his raw materials was essential. The grist was then transported to the brewery, where it awaited its union with the monastery's sacred water, a meeting that would begin the alchemical transformation from dry, earthy grain into the liquid that would sustain the entire community. With the freshly milled grist prepared and the sacred water heated to just the right level, the monks would initiate the most critical and delicate phase of the entire operation, mashing. In a modern brewery, this process is a feat of digital precision, with computer-controlled temperatures and automated stirring. For the medieval monk, it was an art form guided by centuries of accumulated wisdom, acute sensory perception, and an almost intuitive understanding of his materials. The brewer would begin by carefully adding the hot water drawn from the fire-heated kettle into the large wooden or stone mash tun. Then, slowly and deliberately, he would pour in the grist, all while another monk, often an apprentice, stirred the mixture vigorously with a long-handled paddle. This was not a simple mixing. It was an act of incorporation, a ritual designed to ensure every single particle of grain was perfectly saturated, with no dry clumps that could hide untouched starches. The ultimate goal was to activate the natural enzymes within the malted barley, which would then set to work breaking down the grain's complex starches into simpler, fermentable sugars. The entire success of the batch hinged on maintaining a very specific temperature range within this porridge-like mixture, a task achieved without a single measuring instrument. The master brewer relied entirely on his senses, developed over a lifetime of practice. He would judge the heat by carefully dipping his elbow or his bare hand into the mash, a method that sounds imprecise to us but, for him, was a calibrated gauge. The liquid needed to be hot, but not so hot that it would scald the skin or, worse, destroy the precious enzymes. It was a balance between the comforting warmth of a loaf fresh from the oven and the almost too hot temperature of a steeped medicinal tea. He would also use his eyes and his nose, watching the consistency of the mash and smelling the aroma that rose from the tun. A good active mash had a sweet, grainy, almost bread-like smell. If the temperature dropped too low, the process would stall, resulting in a thin, weak beer lacking in alcohol and body. If it rose too high, the enzymes would be denatured, leaving a sticky, unfermentable mess that was wasted effort and precious grain. For an hour or more, The brewer and his assistants would tend to the mash, constantly stirring to maintain an even temperature throughout the vessel and to prevent the dense grains from settling and scorching on the bottom. This was a period of intense focus and quiet reverence, a physical prayer where the monk's skill directly influenced the divine outcome. When he finally judged the conversion to be complete, often by tasting the liquid or observing its clarity, he would allow the mixture to rest, letting the sweet liquid, now called wort, separate from the spent grain. Once the mash had rested and the starches had been fully converted to sugars, the monk brewer faced his next critical challenge, separating the sweet, amber liquid known as wort from the thick, spent grain. This process, called lautering, was a test of both patience and craftsmanship. The entire contents of the mash tun, a heavy, porridge-like mixture, had to be carefully transferred into another large vessel, often a dedicated lauter tun. This vessel was the key to the entire operation, and its design evolved from beautifully simple beginnings. The earliest and most rudimentary method involved a massive basket, meticulously woven from straw or reeds, which acted as a giant filter. The mash would be poured into this basket, allowing the liquid wort to slowly seep through the porous walls, while the grain husks and solids were trapped inside. As techniques advanced, a more sophisticated and reusable system emerged, the false bottom. This was a cleverly designed plate, often crafted from wood or later, perforated copper, that was fitted snugly a few inches above the actual bottom of the lauter tun. It created a hidden chamber below. The mash would be emptied onto this false bottom, and the weight of the grain itself would begin to act as its own filter bed. The dense husks settled on top, formed a natural barrier, while the liquid wort trickled down through the tiny holes in the plate, collecting in the space below where it could be drawn off through a tapped spigot. The brewer's skill was paramount here. He had to manage the flow with immense care. Opening the tap too wide would create suction, compacting the grain bed and stopping the flow entirely, a dreaded event known as a stuck sparge. Instead, he would open it just a crack, allowing the wort to drain at a gentle, steady trickle. The initial runoff was often cloudy with fine particles, so he would patiently recirculate it, pouring this first liquid back over the top of the grain bed. This recirculation, a step modern brewers call vorlauf, allowed those fine particles to be caught by the filter bed again, resulting in a brilliantly clear stream of wort. But the process wasn't over yet. A significant amount of precious sugar remained trapped within the wet grains. To recover it, the monks performed a step known as sparging. They would gently sprinkle heated water over the top of the grain bed, washing the remaining sugars down through the grain and into the collecting vessel below. This required a light touch. Too vigorous a pour would churn up the bed and cloud the wort, while too little water would leave valuable sugar behind. The brewer would taste the runoff frequently, and only when the liquid coming out tasted nearly as plain as the water going in would he finally cease, having efficiently extracted every last bit of fermentable goodness. This slow, methodical dance of draining and sprinkling could take hours, a quiet, contemplative act that transformed a thick mash into a vast quantity of clear, sweet wort, ready for its final transformation in the boil. With the clear, sweet wort now collected, the brewing process entered its most dramatic and transformative stage, the boil. This was not a gentle simmer, but a vigorous, rolling fury contained within the massive copper or iron kettles that dominated the brewery. The fire beneath these great cauldrons, stoked to an intense heat, would bring the entire volume of liquid to a thunderous, churning boil that could last for hours. The primary purpose was deeply practical, a matter of health and safety. This sustained, high heat sterilized the wort, killing off any wild bacteria or unwanted microorganisms that had been introduced during the mashing and lautering processes. In an age without an understanding of germ theory, the monks knew from centuries of experience that skipping this step, or not boiling long enough, would almost certainly result in a spoiled, undrinkable batch. The boil also served to concentrate the wort, driving off excess water through evaporation and leaving behind a denser, richer solution of sugars that would ultimately yield a stronger, more robust beer. It was during this sustained, bubbling turmoil that the brewer introduced his most creative ingredients, a blend of herbs and spices known as gruit, or later, the hops that would revolutionize brewing. For much of the medieval period, the bittering and preservative qualities came from a proprietary mix of botanicals. The exact composition of a monastery's gruit was a closely guarded secret, a signature blend that could include bog myrtle for a sharp, riciny bitterness, yarrow for a floral, slightly astringent quality, or wild rosemary for its pungent, pine-like aroma. These herbs did more than just balance the sweetness of the malt. Their natural antibacterial properties were crucial for preserving the beer, allowing it to be stored for months without spoiling. The brewer, acting as both chemist and alchemist, would add these herbs at precise moments during the long boil. He understood that adding them too early would cause their delicate, volatile oils to evaporate entirely, leaving little behind but a harsh, unpleasant bitterness. Adding them too late would fail to extract their full preserving power. His timing was everything, a skill honed through observation and the careful tasting of countless batches. The shift towards using hops, however, marked a significant technological and flavor evolution that many monastic brewers eventually embraced. While the use of hops was documented earlier, it was within the disciplined environment of the monastery that its advantages were truly perfected. The brewer would add these delicate, cone-like flowers in large sacks to the boiling wort, a process that efficiently extracted their alpha acids, which provided a cleaner, more predictable bitterness than the often erratic gruit blends. More importantly, hops were remarkably effective preservatives. Their strong antibacterial qualities, particularly against the gram-positive bacteria that commonly spoiled beer, gave hopped brews a dramatically longer shelf life. This was a monumental development. It meant that a monastery's beer could now survive long journeys, allowing them to trade with communities farther afield and significantly expand their economic reach. The boil, therefore, was far more than just a heating process. It was the stage where science met art, where raw ingredients were purified, concentrated, and infused with the very character that would define the final brew, transforming a simple sugar solution into a stable, flavorful, and preservative beverage capable of sustaining a community. This shift from a world of diverse herbal blends to the near-universal embrace of the hop flower is one of the most fascinating and complex chapters in brewing history, and the monasteries were right at the heart of this botanical revolution. For centuries, the character of beer was defined not by hops, but by a mysterious and powerful blend known as gruit. This wasn't a single recipe but a proprietary mixture, often unique to each region or even each brewery, combining a variety of locally foraged herbs. Common ingredients included sharp, astringent bog myrtle, which grew abundantly in wet northern European lowlands, floral and slightly bitter yarrow, a plant also valued for its supposed medicinal properties to staunch bleeding, and the pungent, pine-like aroma of wild rosemary. Other additions could range from sweet gale and juniper berries to heather, ginger, or even small amounts of intoxicating herbs like henbane, though evidence for the latter is more rooted in sensational legend than proven fact. The taste of a gruit ale would be almost unrecognizable to a modern beer drinker. Without the clean, predictable bitterness of hops, these brews presented a much wider and wilder spectrum of flavors: earthy, herbal, spicy, and often intensely aromatic. The herbs did more than just flavor the beer. Their natural antibacterial properties were crucial for preservation, allowing the ale to last longer than it otherwise would have. However, this practice was deeply entangled with power and politics. The right to produce and sell gruit, known as the Grutrecht, was a highly lucrative monopoly controlled by local secular lords or bishops. They would license the mixture to brewers, taxing every batch produced. This meant that the very flavor of your local beer was, in a very real sense, controlled by the aristocracy. For a monastery, this created a complicated dynamic. A wealthy, powerful abbey might secure the rights to produce its own gruit, guarding its unique herbal recipe as a sacred secret. A smaller, less influential house, however, would be obligated to purchase their gruit from the local authority, adding a significant tax to the cost of their brewing and tying their spiritual practice to secular commerce. This is what makes the monastic adoption of hops so revolutionary. It wasn't just a change in flavor preference, it was an act of profound political and economic independence. Hops offered a compelling alternative. As a climbing vine, it could be easily cultivated within the monastery's own walled garden, becoming just another crop in their pursuit of self-sufficiency. This meant they could bypass the expensive gruit tax entirely, freeing themselves from the control of local lords. The hop plant itself was also a marvel of natural engineering. Its delicate cone-like flowers, called strabiles, contained sticky resins and aromatic oils known as lupulin. These compounds offered a twofold advantage that gruit blends could rarely match. First, they provided a clean, sharp, and more predictable bitterness that beautifully balanced the sweetness of the malt. Second, and perhaps more importantly, hops were phenomenally effective preservatives. Their strong antibacterial qualities, particularly against the types of bacteria that commonly spoiled beer, gave hopped brews a dramatically longer shelf life. This was a game-changer for monastic commerce. A gruit ale might last a few weeks before turning sour, limiting its trade to a very small local radius. A well-hopped beer, however, could survive journeys of months, allowing monasteries to export their finest brews to distant cities and trade for goods they couldn't produce themselves. This economic incentive, combined with a desire for autonomy, drove many monastic communities, particularly those in hop-friendly regions like Bavaria and Bohemia, to become early champions of the new style. It's crucial to understand, though, that this transition was not an overnight switch. For a long period, monasteries likely used both methods depending on the type of beer they were brewing, the local regulations, and the ingredients they had on hand. A lighter, quicker drinking table beer for daily consumption might still be made with a simpler, cheaper gruit, while their stronger, prized export ales destined for long travel would be brewed with a heavy hand of hops. This botanical dilemma showcases the monks not as rigid traditionalists, but as pragmatic innovators, carefully weighing tradition, taste, economics, and their own hard-won independence in every batch they crafted. After the boil, when the steam from the pungent, hop-laden wort finally began to subside, the brewer faced a new challenge that required not fire, but its absolute opposite. The scalding hot liquid, now sterile and infused with bitterness, had to be cooled down to a temperature that wouldn't kill the living organisms essential for the next, most magical step, fermentation. In the dead of night, when the monastery had fallen into a profound silence broken only by the chanting of the night office, the brewery would spring back to life for one of its most critical and mysterious rituals. Using heavy wooden buckets or cleverly designed copper pipes, the monks would transfer the vast quantity of hot wort into a wide, shallow panna, a vessel known as a coolship. This was not a container designed for efficiency in the modern sense. Quite the opposite. Often crafted from thick, sturdy oak or sometimes copper, the coolship was remarkably shallow, looking more like a massive, repurposed baking tray than a brewing vessel. Its design was brilliantly simple and entirely intentional. By spreading the hot liquid out in a thin layer, it created an immense surface area, allowing the heat to radiate up and out into the air much faster than it ever could in a deep, narrow vat. The location of the coolship was just as important as its shape. It was almost always placed in a special loft or attic space directly above the brewery, a room fitted with louvered wooden windows that could be propped open to the cool night air. Here, away from the dust and disturbances of the daily grind, the wort would spend the entire night undergoing its transformation. As the temperature slowly dropped, the real alchemy began. This was the moment of open inoculation, a process we now call spontaneous fermentation. The night air, drifting in through those open windows, was far from empty. It was an invisible river teeming with life, carrying wild yeasts and bacteria from the surrounding environment. These microorganisms were the unique signature of the monastery's terroir. They floated in from the orchard where the monastery's apple and pear trees grew, from the hayfields where brothers scythed grass for the livestock, from the very grain stored in the barn below, and even from the wooden beams of the coolship room itself, which had absorbed these local microbes over decades of use. Each of these wild yeast strains of Brettanomyces, Lactobacillus, and Pediococcus, along with the native Saccharomyces, would gently settle onto the surface of the cooling wort like a faint, celestial dust. The brewer had no way of seeing this microscopic ballet, but he understood its effects intimately. He knew that the character of a beer brewed in spring, when the apple trees were in blossom, would taste subtly different from one brewed in the crisp autumn. He recognized that a batch cooled on a still, humid night would ferment differently than one cooled on a windy, dry evening. This wasn't a flaw, it was the essence of the process. The beer was quite literally breathing in the spirit of the place, capturing a snapshot of the monastery's ecosystem in a single night. By morning, the wort would be cool to the touch, and often, the first signs of fermentation would already be visible, a few lazy bubbles rising to the surface, the faintest hint of a crossin beginning to form. The brewer would then carefully move this now living liquid into the awaiting wooden barrels, where the wild yeast would continue its slow, unpredictable work for weeks or even months, creating a beer that was truly one of a kind, a unique product of its time, its place, and the silent, watchful night. Of all the ingredients in the monks' pantry, the most crucial one was completely invisible to them. They knew it only by its effects, the mysterious force that transformed a sweet, simple liquid into a bubbling, living brew. This was the miracle of yeast, a microscopic world they harnessed through observation and tradition long before anyone understood the science of fermentation. Without the concept of microbiology, the brewer's relationship with yeast was a blend of careful practice and profound reverence. They couldn't see the single-celled organisms, but they knew their presence was the difference between a successful batch and a failed one, between nourishing beer and wasted grain. This invisible ally was managed through two brilliant, practical methods that showcase their deep empirical wisdom. The first and most common technique was what we now call top cropping. After transferring the cooled wort into their large wooden fermentation vessels, the brewer would watch and wait. Within a day or two, a thick, frothy, creamy head would begin to form on the surface of the liquid. This crossin, as it's known, is a sure sign of active fermentation, and it is absolutely teeming with healthy, active yeast cells. The monk, using a simple wooden bowl or a shallow sieve, would carefully skim this frothy foam from the top of the fermenting beer. He wasn't discarding it, he was harvesting it. This precious, living culture was then transferred directly into a special container, often a ceramic jar or a wooden bucket, where it was kept cool and moist. This harvested yeast became the starter for the very next batch, a living chain of fermentation that could be maintained for years, or even decades. This practice of re-pitching yeast from one batch to the next had an incredible side effect they couldn't have anticipated. It created a stable, house yeast strain unique to that monastery. Over generations, the specific blend of wild and domesticated yeasts in their brewery would adapt to the local conditions, the wood of their vessels, and even the minerals in their water, giving their beer a distinct and consistent character that was impossible to replicate anywhere else. The second method was even more mystical, relying entirely on the generosity of the natural world. For brews where they didn't have a viable harvested culture, or for certain styles they wanted to imbue with a unique character, they relied on the spontaneous fermentation we touched on with the coolship. The wort, left exposed overnight, would be inoculated by the wild yeasts carried on the air. This was a far less predictable process, but it connected the beer directly to the terroir of the monastery in the most literal way possible. The yeast strains floating in from their orchard would impart fruity, estery notes. Those from the grain store might contribute earthier, funkier characteristics. Each spontaneous fermentation was a leap of faith, a collaboration with the local environment that could produce anything from a sublime, complex ale to a mouth-puckeringly sour one. The monks accepted this variability as part of the natural order, and they learned to work with it, often blending batches or using sour beers in cooking to ensure nothing was wasted. Given their complete lack of scientific understanding, It is no wonder they viewed this entire process with a sense of awe and divinity. How could they not? They combined simple, earthly ingredients, water, grain, and herbs, and through their skilled labor, they created a mixture that then seemed to come alive all on its own. It would bubble and froth as if possessed by a spirit, generating heat and giving off the sweet, bready aroma of active fermentation. After this furious activity subsided, the liquid they drew from the barrel was transformed. It was alcoholic, sparkling, and nourishing. From their perspective, this wasn't just chemistry. It was a visible manifestation of grace, a literal example of divine intervention in their daily lives. The yeast was God's agent, a hidden blessing that brought their work to fruition. They might have called it goddess good, an Old English term reflecting this belief. This spiritual view of fermentation elevated the brewer's task from a mere chore to a sacred duty. His careful skimming and saving of the yeast wasn't just good brewing practice. It was an act of stewardship, a way of preserving and nurturing a tiny piece of the divine mystery that had been entrusted to his care. These vessels were far more than simple containers. They were the living, breathing heart of the fermentation process, each material imparting its own unique signature on the beer within. The most iconic image is undoubtedly the massive wooden barrel, often made from sturdy oak. These weren't passive storage units, they were active participants in the brewing. The porous nature of wood allowed for a tiny, continuous exchange of oxygen, a process known as micro-oxygenation, which helped mellow harsh flavors over time and contributed to a smoother, more rounded finish. But the wood's true magic lay hidden within its grain. The complex internal structure of an oak stave was a sanctuary for wild yeasts and bacteria from previous batches. Every time a monk filled a barrel, he wasn't just starting a new fermentation. He was introducing the fresh wort to a complete ecosystem of microorganisms living in the wood. This resident microflora would join the fermentation, adding layers of complexity, subtle earthy notes, and sometimes a pleasant, funky tartness that became the distinctive house character of that monastery's beer. This is why certain barrels were prized and reused for decades. They weren't just containers, they were cherished repositories of a living tradition. While oak barrels were common, they weren't the only option. In regions where quality timber was scarce or too expensive, monks turned to other ancient materials. Clay amphorae, a technology dating back to the Romans, were another brilliant solution. These large, egg-shaped pots were carefully crafted by local potters, their interiors often sealed with beeswax or resin to make them watertight. Unlike wood, clay is virtually impermeable, protecting the beer from oxygen and allowing for a very different kind of fermentation. Brewing in clay created a much more reductive environment, preserving the bright, primary flavors of the grain and hops without any oxidative notes. The thick clay walls also provided excellent insulation, maintaining a stable, cool temperature that was crucial for slow, controlled fermentation, especially for the stronger, more potent ales. The shape of the amphora itself was functionally perfect. The narrow base helped concentrate the yeast and sediment, making it easier to draw clearer beer from the top, while the rounded bottom made it difficult for solids to settle in hard-to-clean corners. Some of the largest and most established monastic breweries even constructed permanent fermentation tanks directly into the architecture of their cellars. These were monumental undertakings, vast troughs carved from single blocks of sandstone or lined with carefully fitted slate. These stone tanks were the ultimate expression of permanence and scale. Their immense thermal mass acted as a natural temperature regulator, absorbing the heat generated by vigorous fermentation and slowly releasing it, which prevented wild temperature swings that could stress the yeast and create off flavors. A stone tank kept the beer consistently cool in the summer and provided just enough warmth in the winter to keep fermentation active. This stability was a huge advantage for producing large, consistent batches year-round. Keeping these vessels clean was arguably one of the brewer's most important and most difficult responsibilities. Without modern sanitizers, their methods were simple, natural, and required immense physical effort. For wooden barrels, the primary tool was hot water, coarse salt, and vigorous mechanical action. They would scrub the interiors with long-handled bristle brushes made from bundled twigs or stiff animal hair, using the abrasive salt as a scouring agent to physically remove any residual yeast or film. After scrubbing, they would steam the barrels by pouring boiling water into them and sealing the bung hole, allowing the heat and moisture to penetrate the wood and kill off any unwanted microbes. To maintain the wood itself and prevent it from drying out and cracking, they would periodically treat the barrels with a thin layer of unscented, natural oil. For their clay amphorae and stone tanks, the process was similar but even more physically demanding, often requiring a monk to be lowered inside to manually scrub every inch of the curved surface. The cleanliness of these vessels was a direct reflection of the monk's devotion to his craft. A poorly maintained barrel could introduce infections that ruined an entire batch, wasting precious resources and failing in their duty to provide for the community. Their rudimentary methods, born of necessity and diligence, were remarkably effective, proving that impeccable cleanliness is a timeless principle of great brewing. This patient, unhurried approach to fermentation was perhaps the single greatest factor that set monastic beer apart from the quicker, often rougher ales brewed in villages and towns. While a commercial brewer might need to turn a product around in a matter of days to meet market demand, the monastery operated on an entirely different timescale, one dictated by the seasons and the liturgical calendar, not by commerce. Once the living wort was sealed inside its oak barrel or clay amphora, the real waiting began. These vessels were carefully rolled or carried into the coldest, most stable part of the monastery's domain, the deep, earthen cellars, or in some cases, natural caves and grottos that were part of the local landscape. Here, far from the warmth of the sun and the activity of daily life, the temperature remained consistently cool and humid year-round, creating the perfect environment for what we now call cold or lagering fermentation. In this quiet, dark sanctuary, the yeast worked at its own natural pace. A primary fermentation that might rage for a few days in a warmer loft could gently unfold over 2 or 3 weeks in the cool cellar. But the monk's process didn't stop there. After the initial vigorous activity subsided, the beer entered a long period of rest known as secondary fermentation or conditioning. This was not a period of inactivity. It was a time of subtle, profound transformation. The remaining yeast, now settled at the bottom of the vessel, continued its work slowly and methodically, consuming residual sugars and cleaning up the byproducts of its own earlier, more frantic activity. Compounds that could cause off flavors, like diacetyl, which gives a buttery taste, or acetaldehyde, which has a green apple character, were gradually reabsorbed and broken down by the yeast. This natural, clean-up process resulted in a beer of remarkable clarity and purity of flavor, a smoothness that was unheard of in faster brewed ales. This extended cold storage also acted as a brilliant, natural filtering system. Without modern filtration technology, the only way to achieve a brilliantly clear beer was through time and gravity. Over weeks and months, any remaining suspended particles, yeast, protein hazes, hop resins, would slowly settle to the bottom, leaving the liquid above crystal clear and stable. The length of this conditioning period was not arbitrary. It was a direct reflection of the beer's strength and purpose. A lighter table beer, brewed for daily sustenance, might condition for a few weeks. But the monastery's strongest, most celebratory brews, the ones reserved for holy days and special guests, would often be left to mature for many months, or even an entire year. The result of this incredible patience was a beverage of unparalleled quality and stability. The slow, cold fermentation prevented the development of the harsh, fruity esters and fusel alcohols that could make a quickly brewed beer feel hot and rough. Instead, monastic beers were known for their clean, refined malt character and a smooth, well-integrated alcohol presence. The extended conditioning also meant these beers could be stored for remarkably long periods without spoiling or losing their quality. A batch brewed in the autumn could be safely and deliciously drunk throughout the winter and into the following spring, ensuring the community had a reliable source of nourishment during the leanest months. This commitment to patience was a physical manifestation of their spiritual values, a daily lesson in trusting in a process larger than themselves and reaping the rewards of dedication and time. Once the initial, vigorous fermentation had quieted down, the brewer's work was far from over. In fact, one could argue his most important task was just beginning, the art of waiting. This period of conditioning and aging was where the monastery's beer was truly transformed from a simple fermented ale into something complex, stable, and extraordinary. While village brewers needed to sell their product quickly before it spoiled, the monks operated on a divine timetable, one measured in seasons and holy days, not market days. The still, slightly hazy young beer was carefully transferred into its final resting place, often the very same oak barrels used for fermentation, but sometimes into dedicated aging vessels stored even deeper within the monastery's labyrinthine cellars. Here in the cool, silent dark, the beer entered a state of quiet metamorphosis. This secondary fermentation was a slow, gentle process, a world away from the violent bubbling of the first few days. The remaining yeast, along with other microorganisms nestled in the wood of the barrels, continued their work at an almost imperceptible pace. They consumed leftover sugars and, just as importantly, began cleaning up the byproducts of their own earlier activity. Compounds that could give beer unwanted flavors, a buttery note or a hint of green apple, were gradually broken down and reabsorbed, resulting in a final product of remarkable smoothness and purity. The porous nature of the oak played a crucial role, allowing a minuscule amount of oxygen to interact with the beer over time. This gentle oxidation helped to soften any harsh edges, mellowing the bitterness of the hops and allowing the rich, malty flavors to become more rounded and integrated. The wood itself also imparted subtle notes, a whisper of vanilla, a touch of spice, a hint of toasted almond that woven themselves into the very fabric of the brew. The length of this aging process was never arbitrary. It was a deliberate choice based on the beer's strength and ultimate purpose. The lighter, low-alcohol table beer, consumed daily by the brothers as a source of hydration and nutrition, might only condition for a few weeks before being tapped. But the stronger, more potent brews, the ones crafted for feast days, to honor important guests, or to be traded as valuable commodities, were treated with immense patience. These robust ales, often brewed with a much higher grain bill, possessed the structure and alcohol content to withstand, and indeed benefit from, extended aging. It was not uncommon for the cellarer to mark certain barrels with a special symbol, designating them for a year, 2 years, or even longer. As these prized beers slumbered in the darkness, their flavors underwent a profound marriage. The sharp alcohol heat integrated and softened, the malt character deepened into flavors of caramel and dried fruit, and the hop bitterness evolved into a complex, lingering earthiness. These aged beers became the monastery's most treasured assets. They were liquid gold, reserved for the most significant occasions, to celebrate the Easter feast, to serve a visiting bishop or noble patron, or to be presented as a gift of immense diplomatic value. A barrel of well-aged monastic beer could be traded for essential goods the monastery couldn't produce itself: fine cloth, glass, spices, or tools. This practice of long-term aging did more than just create a delicious beverage. It demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of preservation and value creation. In an age without refrigeration, they had mastered a method to not only prevent spoilage, but to actively improve their product over time, turning the simple passage of months into an ingredient as vital as water or barley. This patient, deliberate transformation was the final, masterful touch, a testament to the belief that some of the finest things in life, and in faith, cannot be rushed. While the hop vine eventually became the dominant source of bitterness, the monastic brewer's spice cabinet was never limited to just one ingredient. Their approach to flavoring was one of incredible creativity and resourcefulness, a beautiful blend of local foraging, long-distance trade, and a touch of what we might now call culinary intuition. Long before the widespread adoption of hops, and often continuing alongside them for special brews, monks would craft complex blends of botanicals known as gruit. But their experimentation went far beyond the standard gruit herbs. They looked to their walled gardens, the surrounding forests, and even the trade routes that connected them to distant lands for ingredients that could elevate their beer into something truly special. Think of a monk walking through the monastery's herb garden in the early morning, dew still clinging to the leaves. He might pinch off a few sprigs of sweet, citrusy coriander, knowing its seeds would add a bright, aromatic lift to a heavy winter ale. Or perhaps he'd grate a knot of fiery ginger root, understanding its warming spice could cut through the richness of a strong malt base, and was also believed to soothe the stomach. These weren't random additions. They were deliberate choices based on a deep, empirical understanding of how each plant's essential oils would interact with the sweet wort during the boil. Spices like aniseed, with its distinct licorice note, or grains of paradise, a peppery West African spice that found its way north via medieval trade networks, could transform a simple beer into a complex and celebratory drink fit for a feast day. The natural world just beyond the monastery walls offered an even wider palette of flavors, free for the taking for those with the knowledge to safely identify them. In the autumn, brothers would venture out to gather dark, juicy elderberries, which would be crushed and added to the fermenting beer, contributing a deep purple hue and a tart, fruity tang that would evolve over time. In regions where they grew, wild cherries or plums might be harvested and added, their stones imparting a subtle almond-like character from the same compounds found in amaretto. Even the tips of young spruce or fir trees in the spring could be boiled to create a resinous, piney extract that acted as both a preservative and a unique flavoring agent, a technique born from necessity in heavily forested areas where traditional herbs were scarce. Perhaps the most treasured and versatile of all these additions was honey. More than just a simple sweetener, honey was liquid gold to the medieval brewer. A generous addition of honey, known as a braggot when mixed with beer, could dramatically boost the alcohol content, as its simple sugars are highly fermentable. This resulted in a deceptively strong, aromatic brew that was often reserved for the most important celebrations. But honey's magic went beyond mere potency. Depending on the local flora, it could carry the delicate perfume of orange blossoms, the deep, earthy richness of buckwheat, or the light, floral notes of clover. Each batch of honey, like each batch of beer, was a unique snapshot of a specific place and time, and when fermented together, they created a symphony of flavor that was impossible to replicate elsewhere. This ingenious use of local and traded botanicals meant that no two monastic breweries ever produced exactly the same beer. Each one was a direct reflection of its own environment, a liquid testament to the creativity and connection to the land that defined the monastic way of life. The diversity of beer flowing from a monastery's cellar was a direct reflection of the complex needs of its community. A range of strengths and styles brewed with as much purpose as the prayers that marked the hours of each day. Far from producing a single, uniform brew, the monks were masters of variation, crafting a hierarchy of beers that served everything from basic hydration to spiritual celebration and extreme asceticism. At the very foundation of this hierarchy was the humble table beer, known in many regions as small beer. This was the true workhorse of the monastery, a low-alcohol brew, often around 2 or 3%, that was consumed throughout the day by everyone, from the youngest novices to the most elderly brothers. It was hazy, nourishing, and slightly sweet, providing a safe source of hydration and a steady stream of calories to fuel the arduous manual labor and long hours of prayer. This wasn't a beer for intoxication. It was a form of liquid sustenance, as fundamental to their diet as the coarse bread baked daily in the kitchen ovens. It was brewed to be consumed fresh and in quantity, a testament to the practical reality that in a world of uncertain water, even the weakest beer was safer than a contaminated well. But the monastic calendar was punctuated by feast days, holy festivals, and the visits of important patrons, all of which demanded something far more special. For these occasions, the brewer would craft a stronger, more celebratory ale. This was a beer of higher gravities, brewed with a much greater proportion of grain to water, and often hopped or spiced more generously to help preserve its elevated alcohol content, which could range from a robust 5% to a potent 7 or 8. This was the beer served in the refectory on Easter Sunday, offered to a visiting bishop, or shared amongst the brothers to mark the dedication of a new chapel. Its richer malt body, deeper color, and complex character made it a world apart from the daily table beer. It was a symbol of joy and community, a tangible expression of gratitude and celebration that mirrored the spiritual significance of the event it honored. The production of this stronger beer also had a clever economic side effect. The grain used to brew it, having been mashed to extract such a high concentration of sugars, could then be reused to make a second, much weaker beer. This practice, known as partajal brewing, ensured that nothing was wasted, maximizing every bit of value from their precious harvest. The pinnacle of this brewing craft, however, was reserved for the most challenging time of the liturgical year, Lent. The 40 days of fasting leading up to Easter presented a profound physical challenge. The rule required severe restrictions on solid food, but it permitted the consumption of liquid nourishment to sustain the brothers through their devotions. This was the genesis of the most legendary monastic beers, the true liquid bread that has passed into brewing folklore. These were not merely strong beers, they were nutritional powerhouses, incredibly dense and potent brews designed to provide the calories, vitamins, and strength needed to survive weeks of austerity. To achieve this, the brewer would create an immensely thick mash, using a huge quantity of grain for a relatively small amount of water, resulting in a wort that was almost syrupy with sugar. This would ferment into a beer of astonishing strength, often reaching 9, 10, or even higher alcohol by volume. These Lenten brews were deeply sustaining, a thick, chewy beverage that could genuinely serve as a meal replacement. Their high alcohol content also acted as a natural preservative, allowing them to be stored and consumed throughout the lengthy fast. The concept of liquid bread was not just a poetic metaphor, it was a physiological reality. The beer provided complex carbohydrates, B vitamins from the yeast, and a steady source of energy that helped maintain both body and spirit during a period of intense deprivation and reflection. This practice highlights the ultimate expression of the monastic brewer's role. He was not merely a craftsman but a vital provider, using his skill to create a product that enabled his brothers to fulfill their highest spiritual calling, blurring the line between earthly nourishment and divine grace in every sustaining sip. Ensuring every batch met the exacting standards of the monastery fell to a process that blended meticulous sensory skill with deep spiritual devotion, a daily practice where science and faith were inseparable. Without thermometers, hydrometers, or any understanding of yeast cells, the monk brewer's most vital instruments were his own senses: taste, smell, sight, and touch, honed through years of apprenticeship and quiet observation. His day would begin long before the brew was ready, with constant checks on the fermenting vessels. He would lean close to the bung hole of an oak barrel, listening for the gentle, rhythmic hiss of carbon dioxide, a sure sign that the invisible work of fermentation was progressing as it should. He would lay a hand on the wooden staves, feeling for the slight warmth generated by the active yeast within, a tangible confirmation of life inside the still container. When it came time to evaluate a finished batch, this was not a casual tasting but a structured ritual, often performed in the cool quiet of the cellar. Using a long-handled copper cup or a tasting glass known as a tinel, he would draw a sample from the barrel, holding it up to the faint light filtering through a cellar window. He looked for clarity, observing how the liquid caught the light, noting any unwanted haze that might suggest a rushed fermentation or an infection. He would swirl the glass, watching how the liquid clung to the sides, assessing its body and viscosity. A thicker, slower-moving beer indicated a richer, more nutritious brew. Then came the aroma, a deep inhalation that could reveal a whole history of the beer's creation. The clean, bready scent of healthy malt was a good sign. A sharp, vinegary tang or a funky, cheesy odor was a warning of spoilage that could condemn an entire barrel. Finally, the taste itself. This was where a lifetime of experience truly came into play. The brewer would take a small sip, allowing the beer to wash over his entire palate. He was analyzing a symphony of components: the foundational sweetness of the malt, the balancing bitterness from the hops or gruit, the clean finish from a successful fermentation, and the complex undertones imparted by the aging barrel. He was checking for flaws we now have names for: an unwanted sourness from bacteria, a buttery note from diacetyl, or a harsh, solvent-like quality from stressed yeast. His memory was his database. He compared each sample not against a written recipe, but against the mental library of hundreds of previous batches he had made and tasted. This unwavering commitment to sensory analysis was the true quality control, a manual process that ensured a remarkable level of consistency season after season, year after year. This empirical skill was deeply supported by a framework of spiritual practice and ritual. The act of brewing itself was considered a form of prayer, a ora et labora, pray and work made manifest. At every critical juncture, from the milling of the grain to the sealing of the barrel, prayers were offered, blessings were given, and the success of the endeavor was entrusted to divine will. The cellarer might sprinkle holy water over the mash tun, or ask for the intercession of Saint Arnold, the patron saint of brewers, to protect the batch from harm. A beer that turned out poorly was not just a technical failure. It was a spiritual puzzle, a call to examine their own actions and devotion. Perhaps the batch failed because a prayer was rushed, because a duty was performed with pride instead of humility, or simply as a test of faith. Conversely, a perfect batch was seen as a tangible blessing, a sign of God's grace and approval of their dedicated work. This intertwining of the physical and the spiritual created a powerful feedback loop of continuous, albeit unconscious, improvement. A brewer who believed God had a hand in the outcome was also a brewer who would take every possible earthly step to ensure that outcome was favorable. His devotion demanded the most scrupulous cleanliness, the most careful attention to detail, and the most patient observation. He would note that a beer brewed after a rainstorm when the water source was turbid often turned out poorly, leading him to prioritize drawing water only at its clearest. He might observe that beers stored in the deepest, coldest part of the cellar lasted longer and tasted smoother, solidifying that practice as doctrine. What we might call the scientific method: observe, hypothesize, test, and implement was, for them, a path of pious obedience and grateful stewardship. Their quality control was therefore a holistic practice, a sacred duty to create a product worthy of serving to their brothers, their guests, and ultimately, to God Himself. Their entire operation, from the sacred water source to the final aged barrel, would have been for nothing without a relentless, almost devotional commitment to one principle: absolute cleanliness. In a world without the words bacteria or sanitation, the monks operated on a profound empirical truth they could see with their own eyes: that vessels scrubbed until they shone produced good beer, while those left dirty invited failure. Their methods were a masterpiece of pre-industrial ingenuity, a daily battle against spoilage fought with boiling water, physical force, and the subtle power of plants. The primary weapon in this fight was simple and abundantly available: heat. After each brew, the massive copper kettles and iron pots were scoured with sand and rinsed, but the true purification came from the next brew day itself. The act of bringing the entire volume of wort to a sustained, rolling boil for hours on end was the most effective sterilization process they could possibly perform. This violent, bubbling fury killed off any lingering microorganisms that might have survived the cleaning, ensuring the wort entered fermentation as a clean slate. For their wooden barrels and fermentation vessels, the process was far more laborious. These porous containers, teeming with the very yeast they wanted to preserve, also risked harboring the acetic acid bacteria that turned precious beer into vinegar. Cleaning them was a strenuous ritual. Monks would use long-handled brushes, their bristles made from stiff twigs or animal hair, to physically scour every inch of the interior. They employed coarse salt as a natural abrasive, scrubbing it into the wood to dislodge any residual film or sediment. After this mechanical cleaning, they would often steam the barrels. This was done by pouring a small amount of boiling water into the empty barrel, sealing the bung hole tightly, and rolling it vigorously. The steam generated would penetrate the porous oak, killing off unwanted microbes without the need for harsh chemicals. To keep the wood from drying out and cracking, which would create impossible to clean crevices, they would periodically treat the barrels with a thin layer of tasteless, odorless oil, maintaining a smooth, sealed interior surface. Their ingenuity truly shone in their use of natural antiseptics, though they wouldn't have called them that. They simply knew that certain plants made beer last longer. The most famous of these, of course, was the hop flower. When they added hops during the boil, they were flavoring the beer, but they were also unknowingly dosing it with powerful antibacterial compounds from the lupulin glands. These compounds, particularly effective against the gram-positive bacteria that cause spoilage, were a natural preservative that gave hopped beer a dramatically longer shelf life. But their botanical knowledge extended beyond hops. Many of the herbs in their gruit blends, like bog myrtle and yarrow, also possessed mild antiseptic properties. Even the act of storing beer in oak barrels contributed to cleanliness. The tannins naturally present in the wood leached into the beer, creating an environment that was mildly inhibitory to certain spoilage organisms. This unwavering dedication to hygiene was woven into the very fabric of their spiritual practice. The Latin phrase munditia et sanitas, cleanliness and health, was a guiding principle, and the brewery was treated with the same reverence as the sacristy where holy vessels were kept. A spotless brewery was not just about efficiency, it was a form of respect. It was a way of honoring the divine gift of fermentation, of being a good steward of the resources God had provided, and of fulfilling their duty to provide a safe, wholesome beverage for their brothers and guests. Every scrubbed surface and every scalded barrel was a silent prayer against waste and failure, a physical manifestation of their belief that in caring for their craft with such devotion, they were indeed drawing closer to the divine. Their cleanliness, though born of practical necessity, was ultimately an expression of their faith. This profound connection between the physical craft of brewing and the spiritual life of the monastery meant that beer was never seen as merely a beverage. It was viewed as a tangible manifestation of divine providence, a sacred gift that sustained the community in both body and soul. The transformation of simple grain and water into a living, fermenting brew was a mystery they witnessed with every batch, a process they could guide but never truly control, and this inherent wonder cemented its status as something touched by grace. It was, in their eyes, a perfect example of God working through nature and through their own dedicated labor, a collaboration between the human and the holy. This perspective elevated every aspect of brewing from a mundane chore to an act of devotion, infusing the entire process with a sense of purpose that went far beyond simple sustenance. This sacred status was expressed most powerfully through the monastery's unwavering commitment to hospitality, a core tenet of the rule of Saint Benedict, which commanded them to welcome every stranger as if they were welcoming Christ himself. The brewery was therefore not just a kitchen for making drink, it was an essential arm of the guest house. When a weary traveler, a dusty pilgrim on a long journey, or a poor soul in need of shelter arrived at the monastery gates, one of the first and most meaningful acts of charity was to offer them a refreshing cup of freshly brewed ale. This was not a trivial gesture. In a practical sense, it provided safe hydration and vital nourishment to someone who may have been drinking from questionable streams and eating very little. But on a deeper, spiritual level, it was an act of profound recognition. By sharing what they themselves considered a divine gift, the monks were acknowledging the inherent dignity and sacredness of their guest. The act of offering beer was a symbolic offering of peace, community, and shared humanity, a liquid embodiment of Christian caritas, or selfless love. The role of beer extended even further into the realm of charity, serving as a crucial form of alms for the poor and destitute in the surrounding area. Monasteries often functioned as early social safety nets, and the cellarer was responsible for distributing not just bread, but also beer to those in need. This poor man's beer or alms ale was typically the lighter table beer, but its impact was immense. For a laborer whose own water supply might be contaminated, or for a family struggling through a harsh winter, a regular allotment of nutritious beer from the monastery could mean the difference between health and sickness, even between life and death. This distribution was a physical enactment of the biblical mandate to care for the least among us, turning the fruits of their craft into a direct instrument of mercy and social support. The brewery's output thus became a measure of the monastery's compassion, its capacity to brew directly linked to its capacity to give. There is also fascinating, though often fragmentary, evidence that beer occasionally found its way into more formal liturgical contexts, blurring the lines between the brewery and the sanctuary. While wine was, and remains, the essential element of the Catholic Eucharist, some historians suggest that in certain Northern European monasteries where grapes could not be grown, beer might have been used in other paraliturgical ceremonies or blessings. It might have been blessed by an abbot and distributed to the congregation after a mass on a feast day, much like blessed bread. More commonly, beer was certainly present at the lavish feasts that followed the celebration of major holy days like Easter or Christmas, and it was likely used in the pledges and toasts that sealed important agreements or celebrated the dedication of a new church building. In these moments, the beer consecrated the celebration itself, its consumption becoming a communal act of thanksgiving and a shared participation in the abundance they believed was granted by God. Through hospitality, charity, and celebration, the simple ale from the monastery cellar was sanctified, becoming much more than a drink. It was a sacred thread woven into the very fabric of their spiritual and community life. While the spiritual and nutritional roles of monastic brewing were foundational, the economic impact of these sacred breweries transformed them into powerful engines of prosperity that reached far beyond the monastery walls. This financial dimension began with the simple reality of surplus. A large, well-organized monastery, operating on the principle of self-sufficiency, aimed to produce enough of everything to endure lean times. In good years, when the harvest was bountiful and the brewing went flawlessly, they would find themselves with a significant excess of high-quality beer. Rather than let it go to waste, this surplus became a valuable commodity, the cornerstone of a sophisticated economic system that supported the monastery's spiritual and physical existence. The sale and trade of this beer opened vital financial channels. Monasteries would enter into contracts with local taverns and inns, supplying them with a steady stream of their renowned ale. They also sold directly to the public from a brewery tap or at local markets, their reputation for quality allowing them to command a premium price. This beer was also used as a form of currency itself, a practice known as payment in kind. Local laborers who worked the monastery's fields or helped with construction projects might be paid partially with a daily allocation of beer, a valuable compensation that provided both hydration and calories. Furthermore, beer was a common form of tithe or tax payment to the local lord or bishop, fulfilling feudal obligations with a product that was often more stable in value than grain itself. The revenue generated from these activities was not hoarded. It was reinvested into the very heart of the monastic mission. The most visible use of these funds was in the spectacular building projects that still define the European landscape today. The cost of quarrying stone, hiring skilled stonemasons, and crafting stained glass for a new abbey church or cathedral was astronomical. The steady income from the brewery provided a reliable financial foundation for these decades-long endeavors, literally helping to build the great monuments of medieval faith. Beyond architecture, this wealth funded the intellectual pursuits that preserved knowledge through the ages. It paid for the vellum, inks, and gold leaf used by scribes in the scriptorium to painstakingly copy ancient texts and illuminate breathtaking manuscripts. It also supported the monastery's extensive charitable works, purchasing food, clothing, and medicine for the poor who relied on their aid. This economic activity deeply integrated the monastery into the fabric of the wider medieval economy. A large brewing operation required vast quantities of grain, hops, and wooden barrels, creating a steady demand that supported local farmers, hop growers, and coopers. The need to transport these raw materials and to distribute the finished product fostered trade relationships with carters, boatmen, and merchants, linking the isolated monastic community to regional trade networks and even international commerce for those monasteries located on navigable rivers. The brewery, therefore, was not an isolated spiritual endeavor but a dynamic economic hub. It transformed agricultural produce into a stable, valuable commodity, generated wealth that funded art, architecture, and learning, and wove the monastery into the complex economic web of the medieval world, proving that devotion and commerce could work in powerful harmony. While the core principles of devotion and craftsmanship united monastic brewers across Europe, the beer they produced was a direct reflection of their local landscape, climate, and culture. A monk in the misty hills of Bavaria, another in the fertile plains of Flanders, and a third in the damp chill of an English abbey might all be following the same divine calling. But the beverages they crafted were wonderfully distinct, each telling the story of its own unique terroir. These regional variations weren't accidents, they were brilliant adaptations, proving that the monastic tradition was a living, evolving craft deeply responsive to its environment. In the alpine regions of what is now Germany, particularly in Bavaria, the monastic approach was defined by a combination of law, climate, and a deep reverence for the hop vine. Here, the Benedictine monks, most famously those of the Weiss's Brewhaus in Munich, perfected a style that would become a global standard, the Bavarian Reinheitsgebot, or beer purity law of 1516, which decreed that beer could only be made from water, barley, and hops, simply codified a brewing philosophy these monasteries had championed for centuries. The cool, mountainous climate was perfectly suited for the slow, cold fermentation that characterizes the lager style. Their deep, rock-hewn cellars provided a constant, cool temperature year-round, allowing the yeast to work slowly and cleanly, producing beers with a crisp, refined character rather than the fruity esters of warmer fermentations. The local barley was of exceptional quality, and the hops grown in regions like Hallertau provided a noble, floral bitterness that balanced the malt without overpowering it. This resulted in beers that were hop-forward in their preservative quality and bitterness, but remarkably balanced and clean, a testament to the German monastic pursuit of purity and precision in their divine craft. A journey westward to the abbeys of Belgium reveals a completely different philosophy, one of creative abundance and sensory celebration. Belgian monastic brewers, particularly the Trappists who would later become famous, operated with a freedom that their German counterparts did not. Unbound by strict purity laws, they viewed the brew kettle as a canvas for artistic and spiritual expression. The local ingredients available to them encouraged this experimentation. Instead of relying solely on hops, they continued the ancient Gruit tradition for much longer, crafting complex, proprietary blends of spices like coriander, orange peel, star anise, and grains of paradise. They also embraced the wild yeasts native to their environment. In the Seine Valley near Brussels, the beers were spontaneously fermented in coolships, picking up unique bacteria and wild yeast that imparted a distinctive sour, funky character, creating styles like lambic that were unlike anything else in the world. Even within the Trappist order, each abbey developed a signature character from the spicy, phenolic yeast notes of Westmalle to the dark fruit and complexity of Westvleteren. Belgian monastic beer was not just a drink, it was a complex, aromatic experience, a liquid manifestation of a more mystical and individualistic approach to faith. Crossing the Channel to England, we find a tradition shaped by a cooler, damper climate and a different social structure. English monastic brewing, particularly in the great Benedictine abbeys like Burton-upon-Trent, favored stronger, maltier brews that could provide warmth and sustenance against the chilly, gray weather. The local barley varieties, often kilned over harder woods or even coal, produced a malt with a richer, toastier, and sometimes nuttier character than its continental counterparts. While hops were used, they were employed with a lighter touch, often varieties like Fuggle or Golding that offered an earthy, gentle bitterness rather than the floral sharpness of German hops. The focus was squarely on the majestic expression of the malt itself. These were often robust beers, higher in alcohol, designed to be sipped and savored. They were also beers built to last. The stronger alcohol content and hopping rates, however moderate, allowed these brews to withstand long storage and even longer journeys, making them valuable commodities for trade. The English monastic brew was a comforting, sturdy companion, a reflection of a pragmatic and resilient spirit, offering liquid warmth and nourishment from within the thick stone walls of the abbey. This golden age of monastic brewing, a centuries-long tradition of devotion and craftsmanship, could not last forever. The very walls that had protected and nurtured this sacred art would eventually become its prison, as monumental political and religious upheavals swept across Europe, tearing apart the fabric of monastic life. The first major blow came with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin viewed monasteries not as centers of piety, but as corrupt bastions of wealth and idleness, out of step with a new vision of Christian faith. As Protestantism spread, many monasteries, particularly in northern Germany, Scandinavia, and England, were simply shut down by ruling authorities who had converted to the new faith. Their lands were seized, their communities disbanded, and their breweries fell silent. The beer itself was caught in the ideological crossfire. To many reformers, the monastic association of beer with spiritual merit smacked of superstition. While brewing continued in Protestant regions, it was decisively shifted into the secular, commercial realm, severing the deep connection between the brew kettle and the chapel. The most systematic and devastating dissolution, however, was orchestrated by King Henry VIII of England. Driven by a desire for a male heir and a rebellion against papal authority, Henry broke from the Catholic Church and between 1536 and 1541, launched a ruthless campaign to dismantle the monastic system in England, Wales, and Ireland. His commissioners were sent out to investigate the monasteries, compiling reports that often exaggerated claims of corruption and vice to justify the king's actions. One by one, the great abbeys were emptied, their treasures confiscated for the royal coffers, their magnificent buildings stripped of lead and stone, and their lands sold off to noblemen loyal to the crown. The monks were pensioned off, forced into hiding, or executed if they resisted. For brewing, the impact was catastrophic. The institutional knowledge accumulated over 500 years of the unique yeast strains, the secret gruit recipes, the meticulous processes of cold fermentation was scattered to the winds. The physical heart of British brewing was ripped out, and the industry had to slowly and painfully reconstitute itself in the inns and commercial breweries of the towns. The turmoil did not end with the Reformation. The 30 Years' War in the 17th century ravaged Central Europe, and monasteries were often targets for lootings and destruction by marauding armies. The French Revolution and the secularization movements of the 18th and 19th centuries delivered the final blows to many of the remaining great monastic breweries on the continent, as governments hostile to the Church's power seized their assets. It seemed the once mighty tradition was extinguished, a relic of a bygone age, its secrets lost beneath the rubble of history. Yet, a remarkable ember continued to glow. In a few isolated corners of Europe, the flame was never fully snuffed out. The most famous survivors were a handful of Trappist monasteries, a strict Reformed order of Cistercians. Communities like Westmalle in Belgium and West-Vlaanderen, which had re-established itself after the French Revolution, clung tenaciously to their brewing traditions. For them, brewing was not a commercial enterprise but an essential part of their rhythm of self-sufficiency and prayer. They brewed on a small scale, just enough to support themselves and maintain their buildings, operating in near total obscurity. Their beers were known only to a small, devoted circle of locals and those brave enough to make a pilgrimage to their remote abbey gates. In doing so, they became the unwitting guardians of a living library, preserving techniques and flavor profiles that the outside world had completely forgotten. The modern craft beer revolution, which began gathering steam in the latter half of the 20th century, did not invent a new style of beer so much as it rediscovered an old one. As a new generation of brewers grew disillusioned with the homogeneous, light lagers that dominated the market, they began looking back in time for inspiration. Their research led them directly to the gates of those surviving monasteries and to the historical records of the ones lost to time. They were astounded by what they found: beers of incredible complexity, depth, and strength. American and European craft brewers began to consciously emulate these styles, creating a new category they aptly named Abbey Ales. These were not copies, but interpretations, homages to the monastic tradition, brewed with a modern understanding of science and a creative zeal that the original monks would have surely appreciated. This revival created a fascinating bridge across the centuries. The Trappist monasteries themselves, seeing a growing global appreciation for their work, formed a legal association to protect the integrity of the Trappist name. To earn it, a beer must be brewed within the walls of a Trappist monastery, under the supervision of the monks, and the profits must go to support the monastery or its charitable works. This guarantee of authenticity connects the modern drinker directly to that ancient tradition. Meanwhile, secular craft breweries around the world now produce brilliant examples of doubles, tripels, and quadrupels styles directly inspired by the strength-based hierarchy of the monastic system. Their use of complex yeast strains, experimental aging in oak barrels, and incorporation of local spices and fruits are all modern echoes of the monastic brewers' resourceful creativity. The decline of monastic brewing was not an end, but a long dormancy. Its legacy is alive today in every glass of thoughtfully crafted beer, a testament to the enduring power of patience, place, and the human desire to create something extraordinary from the simplest of ingredients. So as we lower our own glass on this journey through time, it's almost overwhelming to consider the sheer depth of ingenuity and devotion poured into every drop of medieval monastic beer. These were not merely brewers, they were alchemists of the everyday, pioneering masters who worked in a space where faith and fermentation were inextricably linked. Without a single textbook or a modern instrument to guide them, they decoded the secrets of water chemistry through observation, harnessed wild yeast through patience, and engineered preservation through botanical experimentation. Their cool ships were primitive biotechnology, their wooden barrels were living ecosystems, and their extended aging process was a masterclass in biochemical patience. They laid every foundational stone upon which the entire modern craft of brewing is built, from the precise control of temperature to the nuanced use of hops and the very concept of a stable, clean, and consistent beer. When you enjoy a beautifully crafted pint today, you are tasting the legacy of their centuries of silent, devoted work. That legacy is perhaps most directly accessible today in the remarkable beers that still emerge from active Trappist monasteries. Seeking out a bottle of a genuine Trappist ale, like those from Westmalle, Chimay, or the elusive Westvleteren, is more than just a tasting experience. It's a form of liquid time travel. With each sip, you are connecting to an unbroken line of tradition that stretches back centuries. You're tasting the direct descendant of those medieval recipes, a beer crafted not for profit, but as part of a sacred rhythm of work and prayer. The complex spice, the rich malt character, the warming alcohol, these are the same sensations that would have comforted a weary pilgrim, sustained a fasting brother, or celebrated a high holy day 1,000 years ago. It is a profound and delicious way to make history personal, to appreciate the incredible craft in your glass on a much deeper level. But the story doesn't end there. This revival of ancient passion has ignited the modern craft beer movement, inspiring a new generation of brewers who look to the past for inspiration. When a brewery today crafts a double or a tripel, ages a stout in oak barrels, or experiments with wild fermentation and forage botanicals, they are engaging in a vibrant conversation with those medieval monastic innovators. They are applying a modern scientific understanding to answer the same timeless questions those monks faced. How can we create something nourishing, beautiful, and lasting from the simple gifts of the earth? This cycle of inspiration ensures that the spirit of monastic brewing is not a museum piece, but a living, evolving force. We've covered an incredible amount of ground together, from the sacred springs to the deep cellars, but history is always a conversation. Now I'm incredibly curious to hear from you. Have you ever had the chance to try a Trappist beer or a monastic-style ale? What was that experience like for you? Maybe you're a home brewer who has experimented with some of these ancient techniques using a cool ship, aging in oak, or crafting your own gruit blend. Share your stories, your successes, and even your hilarious failures in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation brewing. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration. Remember to like this video if you learned something new. Subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten corners of history, and I'll see you in the next one.